I haven't been referring much to Gardner's book Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason in, well, really any of the videos since the very beginning of this course, but I do want to do so at this point, because at this point in his book, having talked about the dialectic, Gardner decides to put in a sort of retrospective chapter called The Meaning of Transcendental Idealism, the point of which is to look back at the entire system that Kant has built up, ask some of the most difficult, pertinent, and famous questions you can ask about that, and suggest answers to those questions. And I think Gardner is absolutely right that this is a perfect point in our reading of the critique to look at the system as a whole and ask some of those questions. Now, Gardner's chapter 8, The Meaning of Transcendental Idealism, is in many ways perfectly clear, and I'm not going to talk about all the things that Gardner talks about. But there are a few things that I want to sort of pick out and either read to you or talk to you again, because I think that they are so important for our understanding of Kant. And the first of those is the relation between Kant's idealism and Berkeley's idealism. Because I think it is very, very easy to fall into the trap, and it surely is a trap, of reading through all of Kant, trying to understand Kant, and still ending up with the idea that what Kant is talking about when he talks about something like appearances is precisely the same kind of thing as what Berkeley is talking about when he talks about, you know, what exists, which are in a sense only ideas in the mind. Maybe our mind, maybe the mind of God, but they're only ideas in the mind. So, in fact, critics of Kant from the very beginning of reading the first critique have been giving an interpretation of Kant that is pretty much like that. And that is, you know, not just because those critics were stupid or didn't read it or something like that. It is because it is genuinely hard to get a good grasp of why Kant's appearances are different from the ideas of an, you know, standard idealist, one could say, a non-transcendental idealist, like Berkeley. Now, Gardner, I think, does a very, very good job explaining this difference in his little subsection called Kant's Non-Phenomenalism and Berkeley's Transcendental Realism, which starts at page 273. And so what Gardner's strategy really is to say, okay, we know what Berkeley's ideas are, right? They are just things in the mind which are perfectly known and transparent to us because they are things in the mind, and then everything else is supposed to be built up out of those ideas, right? So a table is really nothing but a whole bunch of ideas having to do with color and maybe a feeling of solidity and all that kind of stuff. So anything like an outer object, a material object, is actually just built up in some complicated way out of ideas in the mind. Okay, are Kant's appearances like that or not? And Gardner, well, I'm going to read some things that he says. So this is on page 274. What does establish conclusively Kant's difference from Berkeley is the consideration that Kant's ontology of empirical objects is not and could not be phenomenalistic. Right? So this idea that what is real fundamentally are ideas in the mind, and you know, like these things that we are immediately aware of, that we are in immediate contact with, and that anything else, like any object, is supposed to be built up out of those ideas. That is phenomenalism. And that cannot be, Gardner quite correctly tells us, that cannot be Kant's position. That is absolutely incompatible with Kant's position. So let us read on a few sentences further. Kant's objects are subject to the condition of experienceability. That is, they are necessarily related in some manner to intuition. This is not the same as being composed of experiences in any sense, particularly not of experiences in the Berkeleyan sense of elements whose modes of dependence on the subject is that of a qualitative sensory entity on a subject's consciousness of it. This could not be Kant's view. If appearances were phenomenalistic constructions, then the fundamental elements in Kant's ontology would be objects of a kind ruled out by the theory of experience in the analytic, purely sensible objects given independently of concepts. Right? So the kind of objects that we have in phenomenalism, which are these ideas in our mind, are not objects in Kant's sense of objects. Right? One way to see that is that they're just there. They don't have to fall under concepts. They are not rules. Right? An object for Kant is something that sets an a priori rule for experience. Berkeleyan objects are just the elements out of which experience is composed. Right? They couldn't possibly be things that set a rule for experience. They just are the little parts of experience. So that is one crucial difference. And the other crucial difference, which is of course connected to the first, is that when you are Berkeley, you believe that the objects are known to us as they are in themselves. Because the objects are ideas in our mind. And the mind is transparent to itself. And so we know the ideas in our mind precisely the way that they are. Right? There's nothing else. There's just these ideas in our mind that we know perfectly. So if you are Berkeley, you believe that we are in immediate contact, in the most immediate contact even, with things as they are in themselves. Whereas, of course, the whole point for Kant is that appearances are appearances of something, that they are sort of related to this thing in itself that we don't know. We know them only as appearances. We know them only under the conditions of our sensibility and the conditions of our conceptual taking up of that sensibility. And so Kant's objects really are something totally different from the objects of a Berkeleyan philosopher. And so Kant's transcendental idealism really is very different from Berkeley's idealism. So Gardner writes at the top of page 275, it follows that the sense in which objects depend upon the subject for Berkeley is profoundly different from that in which they do so for Kant. The term subject or mind-dependent is in fact heavily ambiguous. For Berkeley, the fundamental mode of dependence of objects is on bare sensing consciousness. Right? If I'm conscious, if I sense something, okay, that's where objects can be. Right? That's where they are. They are just these sensings. So they depend on me in the sense that they need a sensing consciousness, because there can't be a sensing without a sensing consciousness. So that is Berkeley's subject-mind dependence. Kant, by contrast, asserts the fundamental dependence of objects on the conditions of our cognizing, our judging, right, our making claims about them that are informed by a priori insights into the structure of experience. Insofar as objects are for Kant dependent on intuition, this derives from the necessity of intuition for cognition, not from the nature, the ontological status of the intuited objects. Right? A sensing needs sensation because there can't be a sensing without sensation. That's the ontological dependence in Berkeley. For Kant, we need intuition because without intuition, the objects can't be given to us. It's not some insight into the ontological status of the objects that allows Kant to say that they must be intuited, that they must be sensed. Absolutely not, right? That would precisely not fit transcendental idealism. We don't have a priori insight into the ontological status of the objects, and not in that sense. We only have an insight into how the objects have to appear to us, right? So this is again completely different from anything that Berkeley is saying. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that we really should not confuse Kant with Berkeley. Their positions, in a sense, could not be more different. And Gardner points out quite rightly that Berkeley is what Kant would call a transcendental realist. Right? He thinks that we can know things as they are in themselves. And this is precisely why he's led into his disastrous forms of idealism. Disastrous, at least from the point of view of Kant, but disastrous from actually almost everybody's point of view. Okay, next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the thing in itself. So one of the most curious, maybe the most curious concept in all of Kant's philosophy is this idea of the thing in itself. Why does Kant have it? Why does he need it? Can't we just dispense with it, given that we cannot know anything about it? And how are we to think of it? Okay, so on the first side of that, right, when it comes to why do we even need to talk about things in themselves, Gardner gives a very good answer to that in the subsection called affection, which starts on page 287. And one way to think about this is to think about it in the following way. If we want to make a distinction between conceptual activity and things that are given in sensible intuition, between the active and the passive parts of the mind, which is at the core of Kant's entire story, well, if sensibility is to be passive, it had better be the case that it is affected by something that is not itself a part of our mind, that is not itself something in us, that is not itself something that appears in the mind. And so the very structure of Kant's cognitive theory requires us to think of the human being as affected by something transcendentally outside of us, right? Something that is really not already taken up into the structure of our knowledge, right? We are, in one way or another, in touch with something that is not structured by us, by our knowledge, by the requirements of our knowledge. So that is one way to understand that. And Gardner works this out. He tells us that the Copernican revolution requires the data out of which our objects are constituted to be grounded on something transcendentally other, right? Something transcendentally outside of us. And he also says that, claiming that there are things in themselves expresses the cognitive finitude, I think it is, the cognitive finitude of the human subject. It's finite, but finitude. Don't ask why. So the cognitive finitude of the human subject. Here's another way to understand that, which will, sort of appear at the very end of this chapter when we talk about how to enter into and remain within the Kantian system. So here's what Gardner writes at the bottom of page 303. He says, the peculiarity of our cognitive situation, according to critical philosophy, is that we can grasp the perspective which conditions our knowledge only by referring to a point of view outside it, of which we can form a conception, but which we cannot occupy. Right? What transcendental philosophy is doing, it is denying that we have a non-perspectival view of the world, that we see the world as it is, right? But it's also denying that we have a perspectival view and then a way to step out of that perspective, right? Which would once again, it might require doing some philosophy, but which once again allow us to rise above our perspective and, see the world as it really is, or at least understand in what ways we don't see the world as it really is, right? That requires a perspective on our perspective, right? It requires us to step outside of the human perspective. That's not what Kant is saying. So what Kant is saying is we have a perspective and we can't get outside of it. Now, in order to make that claim without it immediately collapsing in on itself, we need one thing. We need the bare thought of something that is independent of our perspective, right? The bare thought of something that is independent of our perspective, and that something is the thing in itself, right? And we don't know anything about it because as soon as we start saying anything about it, we step outside of our perspective and we are no longer in transcendental idealism. But in order to formulate transcendental idealism, in order to claim that we are not actually in touch with things as they are in themselves, in order to claim that what we are in is a perspective, is something like fundamentally human, we need not a thing in itself that we can understand, because then we would have stepped out of the perspective and everything falls down. Also not nothing, because then we are in, absolute idealism and the claim that we know things exactly as they are, because there is only the human way of thinking. No, we need the bare, contentless thought of something that is outside our perspective. And that is the thing in itself. And that is why Kant needs to talk about the thing in itself. Okay, final point to make here is that Gardner spent some time talking about different ways in which Kant interpreters have thought about the difference between appearances and things in themselves. Right? There's this two-object or two-world way of thinking. There's this two-conception or two-aspect way of thinking. The former of which, the two-object or two-world way of thinking, basically says, well, you know, there are the appearances and there are the things in themselves. They're different objects. And we can't know anything about, you know, one half of those objects, the things in themselves. Whereas the two-aspect view would say something like, no, these are two different ways of conceiving of the things in them, of the very same things, really. And I believe that I've talked that way in the early videos of our course, right, where I might have said things like, well, you know, we can think of a cow like as it's given to us empirically. We can also think of a cow as it would be in itself, like without the conditions of the empirical. But of course, that's a bare thought, right? I mean, it doesn't really, you know, have any content. Well, that's the thing in itself, the thing considered in itself. So I have some sympathy for the two-aspect view. Gardner himself develops a way of thinking which claims that actually, from the perspective of transcendental idealism, we can't make a decision between this, right? Because making a decision between these two ways of talking is already to claim a little bit more than we can claim in transcendental idealism. It's already to claim some kind of insight into the thing in itself. Maybe. I still sort of lean towards the two aspect or how does Gardner call it, two conception view. Anyway, it's good to know that those exist. You absolutely ought to, you know, use them in your own thinking, and you're definitely going to find them in the secondary literature if you delve into Kant some more. Alright, that's for our retrospective on the Kantian system as a whole. Next up, we're still going to talk about the final part of the book, the Transcendental Doctrine of Method.